Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, Kareem, floor is yours. We're really excited to hear about racial disparities in voting times.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Aislinn and Alex, for organizing this, as well as inviting me to present this paper. As Alex noted, the paper is titled Racial Disparities in Voting Wait Times, Evidence from Smartphone Data. And this is joint work with Keith Chen at UCLA, Devin Pope at University of Chicago, and Ryan Rolla at the Washington State Office of the Attorney General. I am currently at Carnegie Mellon University, but I'll be moving to UCLA next week. All right, so also this paper is forthcoming in the Review of Economic Statistics. So we started this project shortly after the 2018 midterm elections. And if you recall, there was a number of close races, but one that I think captured a lot of national attention was the Georgia governor election, where Stacey Abrams was running against Brian Kemp, who still maintained the office of the Secretary of State and had control over election administration. And there were troubling reports coming out of Georgia of very long wait times, and in particular, long wait times in predominantly Black neighborhoods. This is not unique to Georgia at all. There are reports of long wait times that you can find basically all over the country. So if you just Google long wait times election and your city of choice, you will inevitably find an article similar to this that has photos of people waiting in line and some reports of people reporting how long they waited in line. This has become somewhat of a trope of election media coverage in the US over the last at least decade. And it's also received international coverage. So this is an example from the 2020 election of world reactions to long queues as reported in the BBC. So this has received a ton of media attention and just public attention, and it's also reached the highest levels of government. So this is a quote from President Obama's 2012 election victory speech, in which he said, "Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time, by the way, we have to fix that. You made your voice heard and you made a difference." So Obama did set up a presidential election advisory committee that made a set of recommendations on how to improve this problem, but it is a persistent problem. Right? And despite this public attention among the general public, as well as at the highest levels of government, when I was going out to vote in the 2018 election and was trying to figure out the optimal time to go, I realized that there isn't really a good administrative measure of wait times, right? So there have been some attempts whose footsteps we're following in that have used retrospective surveys or handfuls of in-person observations to measure how long people wait in line, but there wasn't a comprehensive sort of national administrative measure of how long people wait in line. And so this paper is relatively simple and straightforward. We are just trying to get a good measure of how long people wait in line to vote. And what we realized is, sort of coming back to something Stephen, I think, said during Karen's presentation about data engineering and trying to come up with ways to use the advent of new data sources to measure disparities. That's largely what we're doing in this paper. We're trying to take smartphone GPS sort of trace data to be able to measure how long people waited in line at thousands of polling places across the country where we have cell phones in our data set. So before getting into sort of how we take these billions of pings and turn them into wait times, you might be wondering sort of, why do wait times matter? And there's a variety of reasons why you might want to care about long wait times. So wait times have an opportunity cost, and calculating the exact sort of economic cost of wait times depends on sort of getting an accurate measure of how long people spend in line. And prior papers have tried to do this with, say, survey estimates or the in-person observations. One paper places the estimate at about $500 million per election, right? And importantly, those costs are not sort of evenly dispersed across society. Some folks are waiting in line for hours, and that's time that maybe doesn't scale linearly. So it's not just sort of coming and expecting to spend 10 minutes. It's coming to line and then realizing that you're going to be late for coming into work, or picking up your kids from school, or other sort of obligations. So there's just the direct economic cost. And that's relevant for thinking about sort of, when we think about how to address long wait times, sort of what is the amounts that we're able to benefit from. But there's also downstream consequences that we want to keep in mind as well. So the inconvenience or past experiences with long wait times or anticipating long wait times may discourage voters from showing up, or even among people who have shown the initiative to already come out and vote, they might face a long wait time and realize they can't spend that time and they have to drop out of line. So again, tricky to measure dropouts, but one of the prior observational studies that went to some polling places estimated about 3% of people that showed up ended up dropping out of line before they were able to register their vote. Related to both these points, it also could have spillovers beyond just turnout and registration. It may undermine voters' general confidence in the democratic process. So some work suggesting that election administration problems that people have faced maybe undermine their beliefs about the competence of the election process, and may in particular undermine their belief that their votes are actually counted. That might spill over and affect people's, say, political preferences or confidence in the democratic system. Now, ultimately, equal access to voting, we think, is a core feature of democratic government. So even if it doesn't have these downstream consequences, I think it'd be great to be able to estimate the causal effects of changes in wait times on people's turnout and registration. We're not going to be able to do that in this paper, given sort of the identification challenges as well as the sort of data coverage we would need. We're going to have one cross section. But even if the groups that are facing long wait times have sort of counter mobilization and they're able to sort of not have effects on these downstream outcomes, the unequal cost that's borne by different groups of society is something to keep in mind for thinking about the health of our democracy. All right, so just to summarize the approach that we're going to take, we first started by going out and trying to get a nationwide data set of every polling place location in the 2016 election. So we're going to try to estimate these wait times for that particular election. And surprisingly, I was very naive coming into the steps of these projects. I realized there actually isn't a nationwide data set. So we had to contact dozens of state and county election officials, get various data sources, and then standardize it into a single data set. We then merged GPS data that's created by these smartphone pings, which we got from the vendor SafeGraph. And we started with a data set of about 5.2 million phones, which is SafeGraph's entire coverage back in 2016. Among those, there's about 1 million phones that record a ping within 60 meters of a polling place on election day. So that's going to be sort of our base sample. Then we're going to try to construct wait time measures. So turning the billions of pings that these phones emit into a wait time measure isn't trivial. And so I want to be very transparent about each of the steps we took to try to do that. And then we tried to attempt to filter out likely false positives. So again, we had to get pretty aggressive in how we culled the cell phones out of the data to try to pull out issues with people who live at polling places. Many times they're put in residential buildings, people who are at school at the polling place, poll workers, or people who are passing by. And so the data is going to shrink, but to sort of get ahead of one issue here is that one thing that's nice about this application is it's a place-based measure. So this is going to avoid some of the pitfalls of sort of the non-representativeness of these cell phone data. So these cell phone data, if we use people's infer their home address and then look at census demographics, they look to be relatively representative of the US population on observables, a bit wealthier. But we don't really need the data to be representative of people. What it needs to do is it needs to capture an accurate picture of the queue that people are standing in. So it might be the person who's giving the pings that are going into our data set doesn't really look like the people in front and behind them. But as long as we're getting a good read of the queue that they're standing in, then it's not going to present an issue with bias. So we're going to construct these wait time measures. And then coming back to sort of the title of this paper, I'm going to first just give you some general information about wait times as a whole. But then we correlate this with the demographics of what we think is the polling place's catchment area. So we're going to identify a polling place location, and then we're going to match that to census data for the polling place census block group to try to proxy its catchment area's demographics. And then we're going to regress wait times on the racial composition, as well as in some specifications, a few additional controls. So there is a vast literature on voter access and various papers trying to estimate the effects of different types of aspects of election administration on registration and turnout. So to give several of these papers use border discontinuity design. So Cantoni has a paper looking at the distance to the nearest polling places, finding that distance, increase in the distance of the polling place reduces turnout. There's some work on early voting, where again, using border discontinuity designs finds that access to early voting increases turnout. There's some work on that also uses difference in difference designs. So Cantoni and Pons have a paper on strict ID laws, which finds a null effect. Grumbach and Hill and Bonica, Grumbach, Hill, and Jefferson have a couple of papers on same-day registration and all-mail voting that find positive effects on turnout, particularly for young voters. So this is not at all exhaustive, but there are a number of papers that have tried to estimate these important aspects of election administration. But instead of turnout and registration, what we're going to be looking at in this paper is wait times, which might feed into turnout and registration, but might be a parameter or a quantity of interest on its own. And there have been a couple of papers, a handful of papers that have tried to address this question already. And so we're following in their footsteps. And there's basically two main types of data: survey data that's self-reported, as well as a handful of in-person observation papers. So on the first front, perhaps a nice representative paper in this literature is Stephen Pettigrew's 2017 paper in Political Science Quarterly that uses the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey. So this is a nationwide survey that asks people a few weeks after they voted how long they spent in line to vote. And he uses the zip code demographics to try to proxy for polling place demographics. They can't go more granular on location. And he finds the average wait time in that data is 14 minutes, but there is a large disparity. Respondents in majority white areas report about a 12-minute wait time, and in majority Black areas, the wait time is about 26 minutes. Now, there are a number of limits here. These are course categories that they are given the option to respond with. So I think there's, well, I'll come back to later because we're going to try to correlate our measures with the CCES measures. There are course set of course categories that you can respond with. And then there's also the concern about memory or other types of errors in retrospective evaluations. The second type of data are just sending people out to observe the polling places. So there is a heroic effort by Stein et al. They sent hundreds of individuals out to observe polling places. It's the largest exercise of this sort that I know of, at least at the time. And they sent observers to 528 polling places. They find much shorter average wait times than the reports in the CCS, and they actually find no difference in majority white and majority minority polling places in line lengths. But there are some complications to interpreting their estimates because they control for polling the number of poll workers in these specifications, which might be a mechanism through which you would produce disparities. So in terms of limits here, these are smaller convenient samples, not to discount the 528 polling places, but it's hard to scale this up. And there's also concerns about selection. So in the paper, they note that many state laws prohibit the type of activity necessary to conduct a study as this. And so it might be the places that have the least problems that are likely to allow you to come in and observe the lines and measure them. Right. So those are probably the two most relevant papers in the literature to what we're doing. Now, I think this is a relatively short paper, so I'm not sure if I'm going to need the entire time. And so I do want to come back to thinking about, since this is a methods conference, if you have any ideas of sort of how to use smartphone data to estimate discrimination in other domains. There are a handful of papers that I know of that have also looked at subsequently at sort of other types of socioeconomic disparities or segregation. So Athey, Ferguson, Jensgau, and Schmidt have this paper on experienced isolation, where they construct a novel measure of racial isolation via the sort of lived experiences of individuals, not just their residences, but also the racial composition of the places they visit throughout the course of the day. They find that this is distinct from and also less isolated than residential isolation, but it is very strongly correlated with residential segregation across cities. Keith and Devin have another paper on estimating geographic mobility. So they follow people over 10 months, and they construct multiple different types of measures of mobility, and they correlate it with income. You find, for example, individuals in the bottom income quartile travel 12% less and visit 13% fewer total locations than people in the top income quartile. And then with the pandemic, there was sort of a flurry of papers that have been given access to, or researchers that were given access to, and that have used the cell phone data to estimate, answer questions related to COVID. So Kovin and Gupta, for example, have a paper that looks at the early days of the pandemic, and they find that low-income Black and Hispanic New York City neighborhoods exhibit more work activity during the day in the early days of the COVID-19 period, and that the measured disparities in cases are attenuated after you account for these mobility responses. So these are a few examples. These are all more individual focused measures. And so we do want to think carefully about representativeness, but it gives an example of sort of how you could use this data to think about discrimination and disparities in society. All right, so data and empirical strategy. So as I mentioned, we started with the cell phone data given to us by SafeGraph. It's anonymized location data for more than 5 million US smartphones, and it's aggregated from a number of different apps. Ping frequency varies by apps in use, but the modal time between pings is about 5 minutes. The median is 48 seconds. And we're going to take a number of steps to sort of pull this down into cell phones that we think are giving us a good measure of wait times. And our final data set is going to be 154,000 measures of wait times across 43,000 polling places. All right, so how do we turn pings into wait times? Our first step, so there's 6 roughly steps that we take. So first, we got a list of all the polling places that we could get in the country. So in 32 states, they gave us the entire polling place list, and in 4 we got every county in the state to give us the sheets, and then in 12 we were able to get partial coverage from the counties that responded to us. So we ended up getting 94,000 of the 117,000 polling places. We then identify the latitude and longitude for each street address, and then we match to OpenStreetMaps to get the building shape files for the polling places. And then we identify the centroid as well as the convex hull of the building to try to get a measure of sort of whether someone actually enters into the building to register a vote. All right, then we take our data set of pings that has billions of pings on election day and in the 2 weeks around election day. And we find the shortest geodetic distance between each of those pings and whatever the closest polling place is. And then we define a threshold for the bounding circle around a polling place. So we need sort of a consistent rule for sort of what we're going to consider the line, right? And it's going to be tricky here because there's varying building sizes, and people obviously will line up outside of buildings. So I'll show you on the next slide sort of how we thought about varying this radius to get something that was consistent while balancing a trade-off of getting passerbyers versus cutting off the line too early. And then we identify a lower bound and an upper bound on what we think is the time spent in that circle. And we apply a set of filters to try to remove what we think are false positives. So the first step of defining the bounding circle, we first calculated how many unique devices do we find showing up within 100 meters of a polling place on each day of those 2 weeks. So this is a bar chart showing the number of unique devices that we see on each of those days. So on election day, we see 1.5 million devices show up within 100 meters of the polling place, whereas on the Tuesday before, there's about 1 million, and on the Tuesday after, there's about 1 million people, right? So we see about 500,000 excess phones that show up within 100 meters of the polling places on election day. Now, the challenge is we don't want 2/3 of our estimates to be people who perhaps are going to school or going to church, are doing other things at those buildings. And so we want to push this gray bar down while keeping the orange bar up. And so what we did is we progressively moved from a radius of 10 meters all the way up to 100 meters to see sort of how many unique devices we're pulling out. So we take the difference between the orange line and the average across all the other days. And then this is just plotting the number of unique devices that we're getting. So we see that there's sort of a steady improvement up till 60 meters, and then it sort of levels off. So we define 60 meters as our radius that we think is trying to balance that trade-off. All right, and then you can see the gray bars drop down. So we still get about that 500K difference, but we still have about half of these observations seem to be maybe potentially, false positives. So we're then going to do some filters to try to push that down further. But before getting there, let me show you sort of how I was measuring the wait times. So we start with a polling building from the OpenStreetMaps, and then we define the centroid, right? And then we construct a radius around it. So as I mentioned, we use 60 meters. And then let's say you have a set of pings associated with a device, right? And you have the geolocation of each of those pings. Now it's irregular. It depends on sort of what apps you have open at any point in time. And you might say observe the last ping before entering this radius, which we keep in our data set, maybe is at 8:20 a.m. Then we observe them at 8:23 entering the radius. And then let's say 8:28 and 8:37, they're inside the building. And then let's say we don't see them again until 8:40 outside of the radius, right? The issue is that we don't know between 8:20 and 8:23, at what point did they cross this radius? And so what we are going to do is we're going to construct a lower bound and an upper bound. So the lower bound is the first ping that's in the radius, and then the last ping that is also in the radius. And our upper bound is going to be the last ping before you enter the radius, and then all the way up to the first ping after you exit the radius, right? So in this example, the lower bound is 14 minutes, 8:37 to minus 8:23, and then the upper bound is 20 minutes. And then what we're going to do as our primary measure of wait times is we're just going to take the midpoint here. Right? So some people, they're only going to have one ping that ever shows up in the polling place. Their lower bound is going to be 0 minutes, and then they might have pings between those that are 2 hours apart. And so then that person would have 1 hour as their wait time. All right, so now how are we trying to filter out these false positives? Well, first we ask, do you spend at least 1 minute? So is your upper bound at least 1 minute? It can be that you only have one ping in the building and you've got a lower bound of 0. You need your upper bound to be at least 1 minute. So this would try to rule out anybody that's just quickly passing by that building. So say the radius happens to go into a highway. And you can only do so at only one polling place on election day. So this is to try to deal with people who maybe go to vote at one place and then they drop their kid off at school at another polling place. All right, so that's to get rid of passerbys. And then to try to get rid of residents, we ask that they only spend time at that polling place on election day. So this is going to get rid of a lot of people. So this, if you happen to vote at the place that your kid goes to school, you're going to get dropped from our sample because we don't know whether you're dropping your kid off at school or if you're voting, right? So they have to only spend time at that polling place on election day and no days in their surrounding weeks. So again, that's trying to get rid of residents or people who regularly visit that area.
Kareem, is there any sense of whether that's equal across or like pretty similar across different census tracts? So in other words, if a lot of people were voting in, say, their kid's school in a majority Black census tract versus the majority white, that could introduce some bias in the data? Yeah,
that's a good question. So we're going to relax some of these filters to see if our estimates move around as we relax them. This one, I don't think we actually ended up ever relaxing. So I don't know what the correlation is between if we fully got rid of that, because again, if we got rid of it entirely, it's a bit tricky because we don't know if they're a resident or not. But we could look at whether that's correlated with race.
One thing you could do for too is check, if they're, say, at the polling place, which is the school at, say, 9 a.m. every day for 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden on election day they're there for half an hour. They're there for longer. That could at least give you a sense of whether they are doing both in the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, so if we are too aggressive on any of these measures, even if they're correlated with race, as long as we're not dropping everybody from the queue, then we're okay in terms of our measure. But this could, what you're noting, could allow us to expand the size of the data a bit further. So the third thing that we do is we ask whether they spend under 2 hours at the location, which is going to cut off the tail of these, very long wait times. But again, the goal here is that we're a little concerned that there might be poll workers, and we can't distinguish someone who's a poll worker from somebody who's a voter if their wait time is very long. I am going to expand this one out. So we go all the way out to 5 hours, and we look at whether our disparity moves when we expand on that. All right, then the fourth thing is just, do you have at least one ping in the convex hull of the building? Because again, we're concerned if you just are spending time in the periphery of the radius that maybe you're just somebody who's passing by. And then finally, are you pinging regularly enough to have reasonable bounds? So this is a measure of how many unique ping hours of the day do we register a ping for the individual? And we require that it happens at least 12 hours in a day. Again, to try to get rid of people who say are only pinging at one time in the day, and it happens to be in the polling place, because then we would have a really wide upper bound. All right, so what does this do? This takes this figure and turns it into this. All right, so on election day, we've got 154,000 observations, and on placebo days, it's about like a seventh of that. Right, so we see something like 20,000 observations on placebo days and 154,000 on election day. So we don't entirely get rid of sort of all possible false positives. We do something that's a little bit even stricter in one of our robustness tests, and we get similar disparities with fewer sort of placebo day observations. But we're doing pretty good here. So maybe 13% of our observations are people who might have showed up otherwise on those other days. All right, so this overall distribution. So this is just a histogram of wait times, and the median is 14 minutes. The mean is 19 minutes, standard deviation 17 minutes. So the average voting wait time is 19 minutes, and about 18% of our sample is spending more than 30 minutes to vote. So that 30-minute number is something that was in the Presidential Election Commission advisory recommendations on elections. They said that no voter should have to wait more than 30 minutes. So we're going to use that as a cutoff when we look at disparities as well. So not just get a difference in the average wait times, but also some measure of these sort of tails. All right, this is a comparison if we did the exact same sort of histogram on placebo dates. All right, and so the y-axis here is very different. So the y-axis on the placebo dates goes up to about 3,000 at most, and on the election day it goes up to 15,000. But the thing to show you here is that the distribution looks very different on election day than it does on the placebo dates. And if anything, these are on the other dates, they're sort of skewed to the left. So to the extent that these are contributing to our estimates, they would bias our estimates downward in terms of the amount spent waiting. I'll come back to this later, but when we estimate the racial disparity, if we had estimated those on these other days, we find, if anything, we would estimate a negative disparity. So again, these also work sort of against us finding a disparity between Black and white voters, to the extent that these, 15% of observations are skewing the results and not just classical measure error. All right, this is the geographic variation and average wait times. So what we're plotting here are just average wait times by, I think in this figure, it's congressional district. And you can see that the longest wait times are in Utah and Indiana, 28 minutes and 27 minutes respectively, and the shortest ones are in Delaware and Massachusetts at about 12 minutes each. There's a lot of variation within that. So the worst congressional district is Missouri's 5th congressional district, which had a wait time of about 40 minutes. In all the estimates, wherever we aggregate up to some measure, like the county or congressional district level average, we're going to apply a empirical Bayes adjustment, since there is basically, if you see something that's sort of really skewed, and it's just due to sort of sampling variation, we're trying to account for that. So we're basically taking a convex combination of the estimate and the sort of mean of the underlying distribution, and then weighting how much you shrink it back to the mean by the amount of the noise of the estimate. So that's only going to be relevant when I do things like I try to look at mechanisms and I try to look at comparisons across congressional districts.
Is this a single average for the entire day?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. So this is breaking it up by hour of the day, but across the entire nation. And so you can see that the longest wait, the most, not yet wait times, but the most voters show up in the early morning and at the end of the day. So as one would expect, at the beginning of the workday and at the end of the workday. One thing we do to try to validate that we're actually capturing the right thing here is we also plot this distribution, this histogram, by states that open and close at different times. So 10 states, the polls open at 6 a.m. and 22, they open at 7 a.m. And we see that the spikes happen around when you would expect. So places that open at 6 a.m., we see this a set of arrivals jump up there, and then places that open at 7 a.m., they jump at 7 a.m. And then same for closing hours. During time. Okay. All right. So average wait time by day. This is showing wait times. So even though there's a spike at the beginning of the day and the end of the day and the number of people who show up, we see that basically the big longer wait times are early in the morning. And by the end of the day, even though there's more voters showing up, wait times don't seem to spike up. So it could be that they're sort of learning by doing over the course of the day, or people are responding to sort of demand fluctuations by reallocating resources. All right. To further validate, we correlated with the CCES. So coming back to sort of the work that some others have done using surveys, the CCES is a national online survey of 64,000 individuals, and they ask people approximately how long did you have to wait in line to vote. So this is, again, retrospective, a few weeks after voting. So we used the 24,000 people who reported voting in person, and they had the following options: not at all, which we code as 0 minutes; less than 10 minutes, which code as 5, so on. The maximum category being more than 1 hour, and we just put that as 90 minutes. And then we're going to correlate this with our measures. So we're going to do this at the state level, the state averages, as well as the congressional district level, so 435 congressional districts. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that these things should be correlated. Both of these measures have a lot of sampling noise. They both have their problems. They're also measuring potentially slightly different things. So our measure is both waiting time, time spent in line, time spent casting a ballot, and potentially any time that's spent lingering around the polling place. Whereas the CCES is only measuring time spent in line. The CCES also has these course categories. It's retrospective self-reports. Maybe maybe that's just noise, but maybe there's social desirability bias or sort of errors in sort of inflating bad experiences or good experiences. So for example, in the CCES, about 80% of people report voting, whereas in the US population, it's about 50 to 60%. So there might be some reasons to think this self-report is dubious. Now, we were blown away. So this is what we ended up finding. So this is showing the correlation in state level estimates in our measure and in the CCES measure. So our measure is a bit higher, but it moves very, very closely, right? So the state correlation we get is 0.86, and the congressional district correlation is 0.73. So I think this tells us two things. It really validates our cell phone data as a measure of like picking up actual wait times, but it also, I think, validates the CCES and some of this prior work on surveys. So insofar as you want to do a little bit more that goes back further in time and thinking about sort of the effects of policies on wait times, suggests that maybe these are actually doing a pretty good job. All right. So our empirical specification is very simple. So we've got the wait times, and now we just want to see whether there are disparities. So we're going to be just simply using OLS, and we're going to regress wait time measures for cell phone I at polling place Z on fraction black. So fraction black is the fraction of black residents for the cell phone at polling place Z, and we're proxying that by the census block group characteristics of the polling place building centroid. We're taking this from the 2017 ACS. And then in some specifications, we're also going to try to control for characteristics that might covary with race, but that you know, are going to skirt the line a little bit between sort of over controlling and sort of accounting for confounding factors to the extent that, I mean, we're doing a descriptive exercise here. But we'll control for population density, which again, if policymakers are allocating resources and they're trying to target race, but then you're using city density as the mechanism, you might not want to control for that. But we're gonna look at whether that matters. We're even gonna control for fraction below poverty line, and then all other racial categories. And then in some specifications, we're also gonna control for fixed effects at the state level or the state county level. And then their standard errors are gonna be clustered at the polling place level. So before showing the regression estimates, here's just what we see in simple PDFs of wait times for the lowest fraction black decile and the highest fraction black decile. So in the lowest decile, that's the orange curve, and then the highest fraction black is the black curve. So that is the average fraction black in this group is 58%, and in the lowest it's 0%. Right. So we see in the top decile, folks are waiting about 19% longer in line, and they're also about 50% more likely to spend more than 30 minutes in line. Okay, now this is just using all the variation. And what we get is that moving from a census block that's with no black residents to one that is entirely composed of black residents is associated with about a 5.2 minute increase in wait time. Now, relative to the average in an entirely white neighborhood of 18 minutes, that's about a 29% longer wait time. And then in column 3, we add in all those other controls like population density, fraction below poverty line, and we find that drops it down to 4.96, so it doesn't really do much. And then in column 4, we're throwing in state fixed effects. So this 4.84 suggests that within state disparities are almost just as large as between state disparities. And then column 5, we're throwing in state county fixed effects, which again, if you think the Secretary of State, what they're doing is they're allocating resources on the basis of counties' racial compositions, then you might not expect to find something here, but it still shows up. So there might be a larger role for sort of local election officials. If you're worried about us using this linear specification, it does seem to be relatively linear in fraction black, just with this bin scatter. All right, as I mentioned, I'd come back to the 30-minute cutoff, and this is showing that basically moving from an entirely white neighborhood to an entirely black neighborhood, it results in about a 12 percentage point increase in the likelihood of waiting more than 30 minutes, which relative to the mean in an entirely white neighborhood is 16 percentage points. That's about a 74% increase. Is there a question?
Yeah, hi Kareem. I had a quick question. So what is captured in fraction other non-white? Is this like Native American or something? And why is it so large in the first, I guess, or the second and third column, and then why does it disappear in the fourth and fifth? Yeah, so
I should know this a little bit better off the top of my head, but it is Native American is one group. So if Native Americans are concentrated in certain states, then throwing in state fixed effects is going to sort of eat all of that up. So Native American, I think, is the largest group in other non-whites, but I think also I can't remember if it captures people who self-identify as multiple racial categories, but yeah, that's my best guess. All right. So, all right, as I mentioned, we made a bunch of judgment calls along the way in cleaning. Also, the data is posted, and we post the data without all the filters applied. So you can go in and sort of move these things around as you like as well. So we use this upper versus lower bound wait time. And so we chose the midpoint, but we vary it in these 10 percentage point increments. The radius around the building, you may be worried that 60 meters is capturing too many, say, passerbyers or people lingering around the polling place. So we can go all the way from 10 meters all the way up to 100. And then the reasonable values filter, which was we only used wait times between 1 to 120 minutes, but we can vary this from wait times that are less than 5 hours with no lower bound, all the way down to wait times that are between 4 to 60 minutes. And the splits from lower to upper bound basically does nothing. The radius around the building, once you get down to 10 meters, that's pretty sparse, and wait times are very, very short around there, but it still persists. We still get a significant disparity. And then once you move up to 100 meters, it increases a little bit over a 60-meter radius, but it's fairly similar. So that doesn't seem to matter too much either. In terms of the reasonable values definitions, going from our definition of 2 hours is the upper bound all the way up to 5 hours doesn't really do much to move around the disparity. So it does get a bit larger, but so does the average wait time. And then this drop from 6 to 7 is when we drop the upper bound from 120 minutes to an hour. So wait times also average drops. So the relative disparity is fairly similar there as well. All right. So great example of planning fallacy. I didn't realize I'd take this long to talk through it, but I want to briefly talk about mechanisms. This is relegated to the appendix of our paper now. There's not so much we can say with the data that we have at hand. We don't have identification strategy to sort of leverage this cross-sectional data to say much about mechanisms. We do take some steps. So in thinking about this disparity, this quote from Mario Small and Diva Pager in their JAP article, makes the point that sort of coming back to sort of Andrew's taxonomy of areas of discrimination, they make the point that economists as well as psychologists to an extent have the perspective of taste discrimination, statistical discrimination, implicit bias, but all of these are about an individual making a decision to treat people differently, and we miss what sociologists call institutional or structural or discrimination or racism, which refers to the idea that something other than individuals may discriminate by race. So in this paper, we're largely going to ignore or avoid the taste versus statistical discrimination exercise and instead view this largely through the lens of structural racism. That could be a product of multiple individuals along the way with varying motives. That said, we are going to try to explore some of the correlates that could hint at structural mechanisms for the disparities. So taking Andrew's definition, like disparities or discrimination in another domain in life, how does that feed into the disparity that we observe here? But we're also, it's hard to resist this, but we're also going to look at some strategic or individual motives where we look at partisan bias by the chief election official. So not fully exhaustive at all, but a set of candidates that we did explore. There's other ones people could probably come up with, but the ones that we looked at were arrival time bunching. So it might be that what's going on is folks are arriving early in the day in Black neighborhoods and not in white neighborhoods, and that could perhaps reflect disparities in the ability to take time off of work. And even if two places are equally resourced, if you end up above capacity early in the day, that could alone produce a disparity that we observe. And the policy implication there might be something like election day holiday. So thinking about sort of the For the People Act and the different provisions there, it might be something like just making sure that that's a national holiday and everybody can take time off of work to go and vote. The second thing is coming back to sort of the individual determinants is going to be looking at the partisan identity of the area and or the chief election official. So there, if we did find evidence of partisan bias, you might think of perhaps wanting national oversight of election administration. We're going to look at state voting laws, so strict ID and early voting, where the extant papers generally look at the effects on turnout, but they could also have implications for wait times. We'll look at county level correlates to see if we can find anything. And then finally, we're going to come back to congestion, where this perhaps is related to the other points as well, but perhaps areas that have fewer resources. If they have many many voters assigned to a polling place, you might see larger disparities driven by that. All right, so the first example is going to be looking at disparities in arrival times. We do see that Black areas are more likely to show up early in the morning, not so much after the day. So it seems like it's coming out of the end of the day. And so it's kind of ambiguous whether this is going to lead to more congestion. So the first thing we do is we just add hour of the day fixed effects. And that's going from column 5 to column 6. We just do this in our final specification. We add in hour of the day fixed effects. We also added a control for whether it's an Android phone. Neither of those does much. Now you might be worried though that that's just taking out the mean of hours. And what you really need to do is cut out the morning hours. If everybody's showing up in the morning and you just end up with this sort of nonlinear issue where all of this is concentrated in the early morning hours, then maybe you want to just drop those early morning hours. And it's not exactly the right exercise. We do that. and the disparity still persists even when you're looking later in the day. Now it does get smaller, and so maybe something between like 5 to 40% of this disparity is explained through this arrival time bunching, which again points to maybe election day as one mechanism, but it's not sufficient. So we do need to think a little bit further about maybe unequal resources. All right, partisan identity. So Black voters are more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than the Republican candidate. Given this vote share difference, that alone could sort of provide a motive for Republicans to provide less resources to African-American neighborhoods. On the other hand, if polling resources are produced by many individual decisions and there's a lot of oversight, it may be difficult to coordinate on these actions. It might be easier to coordinate on things that sort of disenfranchise people from turning out to vote or registering to vote, but it might be difficult to sort of coordinate on like the number of polling resources. Relatedly, Butler and Brookman have a correspondence study where they sent out requests on sort of help with voter registration to Republican and Democratic state legislators, and they found no difference in the bias against Black names between white Democrat and white Republican legislators. So it might just be sort of like crosses partisan lines of discrimination here. Similarly, Ariel White and Nathan and Fowler have a paper where they did the same thing with a similar thing with Latino names, and they also got similar bias from Republicans and Democrats, again, despite the difference in sort of the strategic component here. All right, so we regress state and local and county vote shares on wait times, as well as shading the scatter plots by the identity of the chief election official, which is correlated, but not entirely perfect. Now, big caveat here is that election administration is very complicated. There's something like 10,000 government units that administer elections. And so it might not be relevant to look at just the Secretary of State. You might need local county election officials. Contrary to what we expected, at the state level, we actually see that the disparity is worse in Democratic vote share states than in places that have a lower, in places that have a lower Republican vote share, we see worse disparities than in places that have a higher Republican vote share, at least at the state level. When we do this at the county level, it's a little bit more flat, but yeah. All right. State laws, I'm just going to go over this relatively quickly. It's sort of ambiguous. State laws could go in a variety of directions. So strict ID may disproportionately cause delays at polling places in areas where ID is less prevalent. Early voting access could allow voters who would have otherwise faced long lines to take advantage of the early voting process. And so if that is the case in areas with more Black residents, then you might see that alleviates the burden a bit. That said, if access is uneven within a state, that might not be the right measure. And if non-Black residents are more likely to take advantage of early voting, that also wouldn't necessarily hold. All right, so to do this, we use similar data to Cantonian Pons. And if we regress this, strong caveats, cross-sectional, don't have an identification strategy. Strong caveat 2 is that there's these intermediate outcomes of showing up to vote and successfully casting a ballot, and failing to sort of account for that complicates interpretation. So it could discourage actual potential voters from turning out to vote, which would decrease queue length for the marginal voter who does show up. And it also could increase the likelihood that a voter who does turn out would leave the line early. If they realize that they need ID and they don't have ID, they might drop out, but still get registered in our data as like a short wait time by the time they realize this. All right, we don't find anything basically on strict ID or early voting in terms of correlating with the state disparity that we estimate. And then we do a bunch of things where we correlate this again at the county level with different county level characteristics like the level of segregation or inequality, and we find nothing. All right. Finally, congestion. We don't have a direct measure of congestion, so the number of resources in an area per voter, but we're going to proxy for it by the number of registered voters per polling place. We're going to get the national voter file, and then we characterize the number of voters per precinct, and then we merge that to our precinct level data. And then we control for voters per polling place. So it doesn't do much to move around our disparity estimate. However, that's masking important sort of interaction effects. So this is now regressing basically fraction Black, number of polling places per polling worker, and then the interaction. And then I'm just projecting the line for areas that are entirely Black and areas that are entirely white or non-Black. And you don't see too much of a gradient with the number of voters per polling place for non-Black areas, but for Black areas, it almost doubles. So at the bottom at say the 10th percentile, where there's about 1,000 registered voters, the average wait time gap is 3.7 minutes. And at the 90th percentile, where there's about 5,000 voters per polling place, the gap is 7 minutes, right? So it suggests something about sort of maybe congestion is a relevant factor here. If polling places get shut down in Black neighborhoods and then you have fewer resources allocated there, that doesn't seem to scale up as much. So, and similarly, election officials may respond less quickly to adjustments in the volume, and this could lead to this gradient that we observe. So again, it'd be really great to get information on polling resources to see whether that sort of fits that pattern. All right. 2020, this is not part of the restat paper, but we were curious about whether these disparities would persist. And prior CCS work suggested it's pretty persistent over years, but 2020 had some unique features. So there was more than twice the number of people who voted early, and so they could alleviate strain on election day. So if given what we saw in congestion, a sizable enough drop, even without adjusting polling place resources, could lower the racial wait time gap. And if that's more likely in Black neighborhoods, then that could further work towards that. Prior to 2020, Black and white voters in the CCS were about equally likely to vote early. But in 2020, Black voters were more likely to vote early than white voters. And so you can imagine that would reduce the disparity. On the other hand, there was all these injunctions, things like Texas limiting ballot boxes to 1 per county that could have targeted communities of color. And that might have led to larger disparities. So there were 2 attempts at replicator analysis. One was by the Center for New Data and one was by Upshot at the New York Times. So we posted the replication data, encouraged other people to go out and extend and replicate this analysis. We advised one such effort by the Center for New Data. It's a nonprofit that's mostly comprised of volunteers. We gave them the replication data. They gave us a final wait time data set. We've been mostly hands off, but we ran our code on it. Again, things to keep in mind, many fewer election day voters, about 59 million versus 92 million. The data has the number of people in the Veriset data, the SafeGraph data has gotten larger. So we end up with a little bit of an increase in sample size. This is 2020 and this is 2020 on the left, 2026 on the right. Wait time went up from 19 minutes on average to 25 minutes on average. And then these are the disparities. So the left is that same figure, the 10th decile versus the first decile. The disparity remains significant. If I estimate the similar regression, it's about a 3-minute versus a 5-minute disparity. But I do want to caution, this is very preliminary. So we haven't had time to sort of go in and sort of figure out what data coverage differences might be. They did have less coverage of polling places across the country. Given the California Consumer Privacy Act, a number of the cell phones that would normally show up in California drop, and California is a place that has a large racial disparity in wait times. So that alone could produce the difference that we observe here. The Upshot used a different data vendor, Cubic, and they found a figure that looks a little bit more similar to what we saw in 2016. So they again find a large disparity. All right. So summary, relative to entirely white neighborhoods, residents of entirely Black neighborhoods waited 29% longer and were 74% more likely to wait more than 30 minutes. Preliminary, very preliminary estimates suggest that 2020, these disparities have persisted, although maybe a little bit mitigated. So in terms of future work, it would be great to better identify mechanisms. We now have repeated cross sections. We don't have much data to do pre-trends with just two national elections, but if possible, we can start along the path of sort of thinking about the effects of policy changes. The expanding scale of smartphone data might allow us to identify the effects of more local election officials' partisan identities. Maybe that's where it's relevant, but maybe the pattern that we observed at the state and congressional district also holds at the local level. And then more generally, I think we can expand this to think about disparities in wait times faced in other dimensions of life, time at social services, the DMV and hospitals, et cetera. That's all I have and hope. Didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to take some.
Cool, thanks so much, Kareem. That was great. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions. If anybody has a question, as before, I think we have time for one or two, and then we'll proceed with David to close us off.
I was just wondering descriptively, have you, so those graphs which showed the density, those were the density of the observations you had by wait time, right? So have you made one of those graphs that's adjusted for the population within the sort of the population that unit represents, I guess? Because I'm particularly on that graph that it seemed like a lot of the racial disparity is driven by long wait times in cities. And so I'm just thinking like in terms of impact that this has on, you know, people's lives, like what is the population whose average wait time is, you know, 30 minutes versus 10 minutes or.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, so we don't do it with the sort of the graphs, but we do in the regression specification control for population density.
Yeah.
But I do agree it would be interesting to drill down a little bit more and think about like, I mean, we have like the maps, and also in the end of the paper we have basically the disparity estimate for every congressional district in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see like Gwinnett County, where that first news report came out of. There's a really large racial disparity there, right? So right outside of Atlanta. But yeah, there's certainly more that we could do to describe where these disparities are popping up on those dimensions.
Yeah, building on what Andrew said, it could also be an interesting way to look at some of the intersectionality like related to the talk we saw yesterday. So like, is there, you know, a very disparate impact in say poor Black neighborhoods versus poor white compared to the disparate impact in wealthier neighborhoods? Or I guess do you know the gender of the cell phone user? Or?
No, so I mean, everything that we do is basically at the polling place level. So, but we could get the you know, gender makeup of in the same way the census block group, because again, we think that discrimination is happening sort of through the polling place and not to individual like voters. But I do think that, I mean, we control for like fraction below poverty line, but it would be interesting to look at the interaction between the two. I agree that,
yeah, I think
and
like
that is easily that's
poverty
right
and
now.
you know, maybe like single parent households or
Yeah.
children living in things like that would really correlate with it's presumably even more costly for a single parent to wait that long relative to say a two-parent household. So.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
So I'm going to ask one quick question. Hopefully it's quick. I was wondering if you had any sense of, do voters internalize these disparities in wait times? Do voters in minority neighborhoods kind of realize they'll have to wait for longer and maybe show up earlier? Or do you find evidence for things like that? Because I know you mentioned that graph is due to potentially work, things like that, but.
It's plausible that, I mean, some of that does reflect people anticipating a very long wait time and then showing up before the polls open. Now that's like potentially the worst time to show up because the waits are longer then. And, you know, perhaps you would expect people to show up later in the day if that were occurring. I mean, I'm certainly, this is like common knowledge enough that I would expect that voters are taking this into account. And so when we think about sort of, this is observed folks who have come out to vote. And so it's potentially, if you account for the fact that people are anticipating this and are not coming out to vote because they expect long wait times, it could be even worse. And, you know, in surveys, people who report not voting, one of the most common responses is because there's going to be a long wait time. And so, yeah, I think that's.
Are there racial differences? So like, are there racial differences in reported willingness to wait?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think this, it would certainly be interesting, and particularly, let's say, if we wanted to look at the causal effects of these wait times on turnout, and if, you know, Black voters are more willing to wait, then you might find a null effect, even if people are facing disproportionate costs. But I don't know of a survey that asks that question, but it would be an interesting question to ask for sure.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kareem. That was great.